Good afternoon or evening, everyone. Our next panel will explore driving the digital transformation of higher ed institutes. This session will be moderated by Cameron Mirza, the Chief of Party of IREX, joining us from Jordan, who will lead us in this discussion and introduce us to our speakers. Over to you, Cameron.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think it's probably fair to say that this is the final session of the day for EduTech 2020, and it's probably, without being modest, probably the best session of the day as well. We're looking forward to it immensely in terms of understanding a bit more about digital transformation, or perhaps the lack of it within higher education. And I'm delighted that we've got such a stellar panel for this session. And in no particular order, I'd like to introduce Romy Lawson from Provost at Murdoch University, Dr. Dawika Unial, who's the Dean of Flame University. Welcome. We've got Alex Denley, Director of Innovation and Transformation at London South Bank University. And last but not least, Amanda Lizier, University of Technology in Sydney. So we've got a great bunch of people from across the globe to really sort of share their views on digital transformation. So I'm just going to give a bit of a preamble, if you like, as we go into this. When we think about higher education and this word that is bandied around digital transformation, the question I have is, really? If we look at some of the data from this year's Pearson's Global Learner Survey, the fact remains that most students, the majority of students, are dissatisfied with what they've received in terms of digital education over the course of the pandemic. But let's be fair. Educators have been working round the clock in a desperate effort to do the best they can for their students. And what we've seen is an emergency response, a rapid response. But really, have we seen digital transformation? When I visit universities and I talk to university leaders and they talk to me about how they've effectively used Zoom or Teams, my pushback has been that that's really not digital transformation. And what we're really seeing is actually digitalization and not digital transformation. If we think about how education has lagged behind other sectors, government, healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, that have really embraced frontier technologies and data. And then we look at higher education and really think about the classrooms of today. They're no different to the classrooms of 40 or 50 years ago. The question we have is it just a buzzword? Is it just rhetoric? Or is there really digital transformation going on in our classrooms, in the universities around the world, and affecting our students in a positive way? So with that in mind, I'd like to perhaps start with Romy on this one in terms of your reflections. How has higher education dealt with the pandemic over the last 6 or 7 months?
Yeah, and great opening comments there, Cameron. I do agree with you on the things that you were saying. I think that, as a university sector, we had to respond very quickly. And I think there were different priorities that people had to put in mind. Health and safety had to be at the forefront, and just thinking about how we were going to be able to operate and keep everyone safe. And I think after the wellbeing question, we really had to talk about welfare as well. I mean, we had to really make sure that our students could still feed themselves and have enough money to pay their rent, etc. So there were different things apart from the education that we were having to put the digital resources into play in order to make sure that we could cope with people's well-being and welfare. I suppose then when you ask the question though about the education and the learning, did we hit the same standards that we would have done pre-pandemic? And I think the honest answer is no, we didn't. I mean, at some of our locations, we had 3 days to turn around when we suddenly found out that face-to-face was stopping and we were going to be online. People worked extremely hard. They did what they could. But have we seen this transformation? Not yet, I would say. I think we've talked about acceleration, but I don't think it's necessarily acceleration in our technical pedagogies. We are still using similar platforms and just replicating in some ways what we were doing face to face. But where I think we have seen acceleration is in some of the mindsets. I've seen a change in staff, in their willingness to engage now and to try new things and to see that these things can work. And I've also seen a change in the students who were like, oh, we don't want to have it that way, we don't want to have this way. They actually now are recognising where they do want their digital elements, the digital objects for their learning and how they can best use them, and where they still want some face-to-face and that connectedness. So I think that's where we've seen the acceleration perhaps in mindset, but I still think we've got a long way to go with that transformation. But it's an exciting time is what I would say, and I want to see where we're going to go next. We can't stop, we have to keep going forwards.
And that's great insight. And I'd probably agree that we've seen more acceleration in the last 6 months than we've seen in the last 60 years in higher education. I think we've come a long way. Alex, coming over to you at South Bank, I know London South Bank's done some really interesting things, particularly around entrepreneurship, particularly around creating bite-sized learning opportunities for young people. With your demographic as well, I'm thinking about equity here. Access to infrastructure. How has London South Bank dealt with the last 6-7 months?
Yeah, thanks. And to be honest, for me, I think a lot of this stuff was already in the pipeline anyhow. We were already on this journey in terms of transformation, and certainly transformation for me is not a one-time thing, it's an evolutionary thing. For us, we're already on the journey in terms of introducing things like the Microsoft stack with 365, the introduction of Teams, which we were heavily trying to adopt and suddenly accelerated, as you can imagine, at the forefront of the pandemic. So I think from a technology perspective, we've always worked in a kind of hybrid world anyhow, certainly from an operational perspective. But in terms of student side, we'd always accounted for having a global kind of student population within London South Bank, despite being the physical campus being there. What the pandemic did was, I suppose, from a technology, we'd always encountered for students having technology, everything anywhere kind of philosophy, but we'd never expected the entire institution almost overnight to suddenly start working remotely. So the things for us, first of all, it was about stability, and I quoted, and I just started to stop quoting it, but I suddenly started re-saying it was the fact keeping the light. Never has keeping the lights on been more important than now. It was around stability. So it was effectively things like connectivity. So did we have the connection to the campus? Did we have the security measures in place to accommodate that amount of connections hitting our firewall? And did we have the licensing? One thing we had is we'd never accounted for that amount of people actually trying to gain access. And all of these things started emerging really, really rapidly in terms of just simple things in the first instance, just trying to gain access to things like Outlook, being able to use the Office portfolio, and then gradually started to see the introduction of systems. Fortunately, we'd been trying to move away from kind of the bespoke systems of the past where we built and had them running on premise. And one already as part of our IT strategy was to have software as a service. But there was also, so that was fine in terms of being able to gain access via a web browser. But it was more around the kind of intricacies, the kind of systems that make us an institution that had been there for many years that were running on premise, that we needed, people wanted to gain access to. So we had, it was firstly a level of investment, some new technologies that need to be introduced. And I also saw a kind of big disruption in terms of the software that were available. Suddenly, all of these technologies became there, ready to be invested in. There were so many different ways to turn. And we were trying to avoid a knee-jerk reaction while selecting, actually understanding, well, what is it we're trying to do before just rushing in and investing. So, as I say, exploring technologies, understanding what it is we were trying to achieve in the first instance, but a little bit similar to the previous speaker was just saying, it's all about, it was also educating people in terms of the new way of delivery as well. And it'd be fair to say in terms of 6 months, we have managed to achieve a remote means of of education, and certainly an operating side of things. And we've still got a long way to go. I think the difference is it's become more acceptable, and that the fact people have more of a trust and reliance on technology than ever before. And I think it will continue to do so. I can't, we've started to creep back into campus now, and certainly students are doing so. But I don't think it will ever be one or the other. I don't think we'll always be on campus or will always be remote. I think we've opened up a means of being a hybrid model going forward. So yeah.
Okay. I mean, you made some great points. I mean, hybrid model. I think universities are trying to adopt a hybrid model. But we'll have to see when the next shutdown might happen. There's all sorts of existential issues that we're facing right now. Great point about thinking about digital transformation as part of a strategic approach. I think we shouldn't judge where higher education will be in 10 years' time based on today. And with that in mind, Dawika, in terms of Flame University, what's been your approach in terms of handling this disruption really to higher education?
Thank you, Cameron, and amazing points by Romy and Alex. With us, the thing was a little different because we are a relatively smaller private liberal arts university, and the experiential part is as much as the learning part of it is part of our value proposition, which means we are a compulsorily residential campus-driven university. And when this whole pandemic hit and government notifications came that we have to close our campuses and so on and so forth, we were at the fag end of our semester. So we had a large population of students to be graduated on time. I had a large population of students who were doing their masters and they had their jobs. They were MBA students and they had to go on the job market with their degrees in hand. So immediately what we had to do was to ensure that kind of seamlessly transition the face-to-face teaching to digital mode for almost a month and a half to ensure, and then the examination and the grading and evaluation so that a virtual convocation can happen so that the batch which is graduating is not suffering. So we had 3 stages. First stage was between March to mid-May, where in 2 months' time, we had to ensure that we move our face-to-face permanently residential campus to almost digital in 3 days' time to 4 days' time. We had to send every kid back home. We had to vacate the hostels. We had to put our faculty back to their homes and then start moving into that direction. So we put up a digital task force, and that point of time, we didn't have the Zoom license or Microsoft Team licenses and others. So we had a Google Suite, and hence we moved to a Gmeet at that point of time and converted our offline classes into an online. We started using Slack. We had WhatsApp coming in. So we had multiple approaches, asynchronous, synchronous, to ensure that we finished this. Similarly, when examination, proctoring, how to go about it, evaluations, grading need to come on time. These are big issues. Well, when you have a batch to graduate, but then from May till August, we had some time because university was closed, and we then started investing a lot of hardware and software, and the money to be diverted because we were building one of the largest sports complexes in the private university space in India. We have put in a lot of money creating a huge sports infrastructure because sports is big in a liberal arts setup. And then we had to divert our resources to computer technologies. We have diverted our resources from building, huge infrastructure to software to getting more. And then we had to train our faculty, which was so used to in so many years in only face-to-face, because they were not, and mind you, because we have 20 different majors at undergraduate and postgraduate level. They are dance, music, theater, sociology, psychology, mathematics, to business subjects, to communication. So we had a huge plethora of diverse kinds of teaching to be done to the students, and which is not straightforward for a business school professor. It's easy to just take it up, take it to case method, get into Zoom. But for a dance professor, theater one, music, clinical people, physics, for example, what will happen to our labs? That all had to be sorted out, and it took us some time, as Romy has said. It has accelerated our investment in technology. It has accelerated our learning curve. It has forced all of us to come out of our comfort zones of a face-to-face classroom teaching and to start learning. So we put up a huge task force to train. So we ran multiple training programs. We brought external trainers to do it. We experimented with multiple technologies. We completely revamped our learning management system. We integrated Zoom into the learning management system. So it's still first month for us. We started for 1st of September. We started late, almost 1.5 months late. It's just been one month for us. And so far, students have kind of accepted this mode of learning, but it's still very, very new for us at this point of time to get into any other way that how do we go from there? It's a long way for us.
And you're experiencing what many institutions around the world are experiencing right now in terms of this is an iterative process and it's going to take a bit of time. And you made a great point about how do we, replicate those real world experiences, whether it be dance, whether it be art. And we'll talk about the future in terms of what VR and AR may bring to the classroom. But Amanda, Australia's going through difficult times, many parts of the country in lockdown. How has your institution in Sydney dealt with the pandemic?
I think it's a very similar experience to what everyone else has described. So we're fortunate in many ways. We had a lot of technology already in place. We maybe in a lot of cases weren't using it to its fullest potential, but it was at least there. I know the degree I teach into, the Master of Education degree, we were really lucky because we'd moved across to a new platform, which was much more flexible. We'd done a lot of work already. So in some ways we were luckier than others even in our own institution. There was quite a difference in what was available, what people had used before. I mean, I'm lucky as well. My expertise is in learning design. I teach in education, so we were already a little bit ahead of the game. I think the interesting thing, everyone's talked about technology, and I absolutely agree with that. And I think to build on it, one of the things that we're now finding, because in Australia we didn't have the luxury of a break in the middle of the year. Our academic year runs, from sort of February, March through to November. So we haven't really had a breather in between. It's been very iterative, very constant. And one of the things that's been interesting is how the systems and processes in the institution have been much slower to adapt. So we've been able to adapt to the teaching and learning, and that hasn't always been perfect. But as everyone said, we've sort of done what we could. But what we're finding is, we've got quite antiquated systems in some ways. So when they're calculating teaching hours, for example, there's a certain privileging of the face-to-face as opposed to the online. And, I guess the bureaucracy is trying to rectify that, but it does make it a bit more difficult because then it places that emphasis back on, for example, I've designed my subjects that there's no substantive content delivered via Zoom because that's for connection. I can't guarantee it's equity. Some students don't have reliable internet. Some people don't have a quiet place to work. So anything that you're going to need to do your assessments or do your exam is delivered asynchronously. However, what I measured on, though, is what's the face time? How much time have I spent with students face to face? So I think some of those systems and processes as well in the background, we're going to need to work on those as well in terms of what are we recognising as teaching and learning.
Well, that takes me on to the next point, and I'll stay with you, Amanda, because one of my reflections, having looked at teaching online and so on, is that, and the student experience, is that we have not given enough thought, and I'm talking broadly here, universities haven't given enough thought to instructional design, learning design, assessment, effective pedagogy. What I've witnessed has basically been 50-minute monologues given by academic staff. Now, if we think about the student experience, I mean, I know universities where they've delivered 100% online and yet ask students to come into campus to pay their tuition fees because you haven't got the facility to pay online. It seems to me that we've got a long way to go in terms of the student experience. Drawing on your experience, Amanda, and what you're doing in terms of using technology at Sydney, what are the things that universities should be really thinking about in terms of how best to use technology, in particular around the student experience. How can we use it more effectively, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And for a long time, I think we've really privileged the content. We have to deliver the content, and it's been less about the method, less about the pedagogy, more about just, that very transactional approach, I think, just filling up people's heads with information. And that's been slowly changing. But I think, as Alex mentioned before, it's about that's been accelerating. And I know at UTS was a lot of work put in right back since 2014 to really start looking at teaching and learning, and how can we not give a 50-minute monologue? I mean, interestingly, UTS has now decided that there will be no more lectures ever. We're not lecturing anymore. We're going to use, very much embed a flipped learning approach. So, short, sharp, make sure it's interactive. These sort of principles. I think something that we've found as well, because we're very multicultural, and we've always had students from overseas, and some of whom are now still physically overseas, is even remembering things like, if English is not your first language, trying to learn over Zoom is extremely difficult, for example. Things like that need to be considered as well. So, interactivity, there's a lot of debate around, should you make people turn on their cameras or not? And, those sort of things. And in some cultures, they don't want to. I had one student say quietly to me, he was embarrassed about where he lived. He shared with a lot of other people. So it's not just about the learning. Yes, we need to think about that, but also the students as people. What's happening for them. I've had students who are nurses, who are frontline workers, people who are losing jobs, homeschooling children. That's really important as well. We're dealing with adult learners here, which is quite different.
I mean, you made some great points, Amanda. And Alex, I'll bring you in here because Amanda raised a couple of really interesting points. One, about flipped classroom, and I know Southbank has used a flipped classroom approach, but also about the fact that, I don't know just for certain, but I would imagine a lot of your students are working professionals, doing full-time jobs. So with that in mind, how have you managed to kind of adopt a teaching and learning philosophy that really does meet the needs of your learners?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think the misconception is, and thanks to the research on Southbank, we do have the highest proportion of mature students in any university in the UK. And I'll just kind of go back to the point. I think there's two sides to it, really. You're trying to bring the technology to the student regardless of location. So that's, wherever they are, they should be able to get the same access whether they're on campus or not. But on the flip side, it's kind of saying, you still want to give them a reason to come to campus. And for me, it's around communication and collaboration. And there's things like, technology is an enabler, let's be very clear about that, but there's nothing better than face-to-face. I think ultimately that. For us, fortunately, the technology has been around, so even the platform we're using today have been using for many, many years. And I think this kind of level of social skills and so on, and kind of if we reference some of the more physical kind of degrees and courses that people are doing, that simply are there ways of replicating that virtually? And I think that's a kind of level of unknown at this stage. I think we're starting to see it's kind of early days where the digital disruptiveness is happening now. If I were to look in kind of 2020, I think that really is that kind of big awakening, largely in HE, but I think in any organisation, to be totally honest with you, one of the first engagements I had of our executive right back in March when the pandemic first broke out was just simply doing what we're doing today, like a virtual boardroom, where those traditionally we had huge, great big boardrooms. It was very much kind of pen and paper, but very face-to-face kind of interaction. And then he realised, just doing this kind of new way of working was actually, well, why have we not done this before? Why am I only seeing it now? And I'm like, well, I've been trying to sell it to you for many, many years. And maybe it was just the fact that actually, I think people have had that kind of switch over from the kind of legacy way of interacting to what we're doing now. Things that kind of bits I've jumped out of, and as much as, yes, you can replicate a virtual boardroom, you can do that. It's more larger things like how do you replicate like the lecture theatres, seminars, webinars. We've just had our welcome week, things like kind of, as you you say, kind of virtual tours of the campus. And really kind of for freshers as an example, how do you make someone feel part of an institution? And that's been really, really interesting this year. It's nothing but, until it's trying to, almost like bringing somebody new into a company or a new student joining an institution. How do you really embed them and make them feel part of, the actual uni that they've joined? And what differentiates yourself? Because otherwise everybody's going to become almost, it doesn't matter which university I go to, it's all the same in terms of the experience I get there, which I don't necessarily know all the answers, in total honesty, because the technology is the enabler to be able to continue to collaborate and communicate. And there's so much still that we're learning. I think going back to your point is, and one thing I've acknowledged is the fact, well, whilst we've gone through this kind of disruptive stage, we should actually start learning and actually monitoring how people are interacting, understanding what's working and what's not. And ultimately that should feed into our strategy going forward, because I don't think anybody knows. No one's really kind of been truly mastered this for such a period of time that we can actually learn from and kind of that can steer the ship as such. Things like kind of some of the technologies we've invested in, like polling software, so that you can question and answer kind of approach. Video tagging, I think another thing that we're doing is where we can't have, we're in a hybrid model, things where there's a practical session taking place that can be recorded, and actually kind of people can engage actively while someone is conducting a kind of physical, kind of practical kind of demonstration that you can capture, you can tag. And certainly for us, the School of Health as an example, where somebody could be replicating a medical operation, which can be very tight, very long and complex. And the fact is actually in some ways it's better because you can watch it over and over again. Lecture capture we had introduced for a while, but what we're seeing is, we hadn't encountered, was how the sheer amount of volume that we're driving through lecture capture. And it's also started to show cracks a little bit in our virtual learning environment as well. I think the VLEs have really probably been a little bit of a weak spot, because we've had to suddenly manage and modernize those, maintain them, and actually try and almost kind of in some way shoehorn other solutions into them, because that's the natural engagement point where the students want to interact. I think as well as it, as I say, it's all about the data. For me, it's learning from what's going on, leveraging the data from all of these technologies. And some of the more legacy kind of products, as I say, as we try and now almost make them become digital, are showing signs of whether they can or they can't. And I take Amanda's point as well. It's the technology is one thing, but it's also, for me, it's bringing the academics on board. And actually transitioning or digitalizing some of the literature and the way that they've been teaching for many, many years. And that's where we're probably having to lean on expertise outside of the institution to help us try and do that as we transition kind of our, I suppose, academic delivery into a digital fashion that's fit for purpose and kind of in almost like a social media kind of environment. And I could keep going. There's lots and lots of different things. I think just the last bit I'll say is, it sounds great, and it's almost like an iceberg scenario. Always people just want to see the shiny surface, the bit that the student sees. For me, one of the other things is the sheer amount. It's the underlying infrastructure, and what separates higher education from most is the sheer complexity and the architectural landscape that sits beneath it. Large amount of potential technical debt investments of the past that have just done, well, they did what they're supposed to do, and now we're trying to change everything to make it become digital. Integration is really big, and that's what I'm seeing a lot in our higher education now, trying to undo kind of manual ways of welding things together with sticky tape, with the introductions of things like integration layer that immediately kind of show value and benefits realization, that leverage the data to allow you to do some of this digital stuff.
Great. I mean, that's really, really insightful, Alex. I think that, moving to the future, and Romy and Dawika, I want to come to you on this now. Let's look to the future. We hear a lot about AI, blockchain, cloud, big data, AR, VR. We hear all these things, and yet when it came down to it, where perhaps disruptive technology or frontier technology needed to step forward in education, we fell back on Zoom and Teams and pretty low tech, devices to get us through. Let's look to the future. Where do you think the opportunities are for these frontier technologies to come in and really support teaching and learning for young people, and to really sort of move higher education forward, if you like. I'd be interested to get your views on it. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that, you know, we weren't able to do graduation ceremonies this year, which is obviously a great part of any student's experience. And yet I saw great examples of universities doing drive-through graduations. Obviously, you know, not much attention being given there to the effects on the environment, but surely in this day and age, we could be using technology far smarter than we're using today. Romy, let me come to you on this. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really like Amanda talking about the fact of how this is changing, you know, the pedagogy moving forward.
Yeah.
I'm a great believer that technology is not the first thing you should think about. You should be thinking about what should the learning experience be, and then you find the technology that will help service that. And so I'm very much with Amanda, you know, that it's great that, you know, we've gone from this very content heavy kind of lecture format, and now a lot of universities saying, hey, why are we doing that? Let's not do that into the future. Let's think differently. So I think that has to be the start. And to me, the disruption has to be about thinking about what our pedagogy is in universities rather than just what the technology is, and then, as I say, having the technology help drive it. And I think one of the things that we've really tried to reach out and do is very much looking at that real world. So, you know, for example, we didn't try and replicate things. We have a vet hospital at Murdoch University. We didn't try and replicate surgery and stuff. We actually had the vet surgeons with a GoPro on their heads doing surgery so that the students could interact, could, you know, be texting the messages, the questions and stuff like that. And as Alex said, yeah, they could then watch it again later. But it was that when you think about medicine, they talk about, you know, see one, do one, teach one. So they were able to do the see one in that kind of way. Again, we have counselling, we have clinical psychology. Allowing those students to have real world experiences meant looking at what was happening in the real world during the pandemic, and telehealth, telemedicine was really accelerated during this time. So our students became part of that wave, and, you know, they had to learn about telemedicine and actually interact in that way. Same in our education. We were very worried about our students not being able to have their professional practice as, you know, teachers. But teachers were having to teach online, so why couldn't student teachers teach online? And so it was looking at, you know, what needed to do in the real world, and then adapting to that and looking at how we needed to use the technology to get us there. So to me, I think that's where I would like to think about what disruptions are needed, what our future looks like into the future. Well, what do we actually want to make a student's learning experience like? Make it very student-centered, make it very real world, and then think about, well, what's the technology that will take us to that point?
I couldn't agree more. And the point about work placement has obviously been a critical one for universities in terms of securing work placements during the lockdown period. And obviously we've seen great, you know, innovation around virtual internships, young people now being able to basically work for companies around the world on a project-based, you know, and project-based solutions. So I think we're going to see that more and more, this global marketplace for young people. Dawika, come to you. You know, talk to me about how a liberal arts institution and technology, how do you see the future panning out for Flame University as we talk about frontier technologies?
I think pretty interesting point being raised by Amanda in terms of investment on the instructional design part of it. I think as a liberal arts university, because we deal with the large variety of subjects and courses and others, that's where we have to focus a lot more on in terms of how do we, you know, transform our pedagogy. That is one. Secondly, I think the focus needs to now shift from preparing to teach versus ensuring that the students learn. I think if we just bring, just like in typical marketing sense, we talk about customer centricity. Here, if you bring a student centricity environment of learning, and then change everything, what we do is to ensure that the student learning experience is at the center of it. You know, a couple of months ago, I was trying to find scales to measure learning experience. because I was doing a consulting for it. And this is before the pandemic hit, and I was working for an edtech company as some consulting project with my students, and we were trying to measure the learning experience, and there not enough research is being done in terms of digitally how to measure the learning experience, not the student surveys and so on and so forth. I think that's one level one needs to really try and figure it out in terms of how do you create that learning environment, virtual or otherwise, so that students are able to learn. Second, I think we have not invested enough in P2P learning. Everything in any other technology, any other business, you see there's a lot of P2P work happens. Education has not been able to do that, to facilitate it. Third, I think if you start looking at larger businesses, they work on collaboration. Educational institutions are the one who have never collaborated except through various smaller MOUs, and they have never collaborated. They're always working in silos with each other. My business, my work, my students, and I'm fighting for the same. I think this will help now break these shackles. Just to give an example, I'm working with the team just like we are doing this seminar. I'm working with a cross-country team of professors with University of Cincinnati. They're doing a very beautiful program called Back to Business for people who have lost their jobs in the pandemic and upskill them. And it's all part of our service. So everybody is doing a pro bono work. And there are 7 of us in 6 different countries and with 45 different students from 20 different countries are learning. We start on 9th of October. It will go for 1 month. I think this is the way forward, wherein if I have a great instructor in Amanda's University who is doing a very beautiful program which fits in to my kind of program out here, probably we can find out a way to not replicate the same thing and probably dovetail it with them, for example. I'm saying there are ways through which collaboration is possible, not just by faculty or joint research or co-teaching. I think co-teaching can be a great way to go about it. We have a consortium of liberal arts institution called GLA, and a lot of our courses actually are taught across 18 to 20 Great Lakes Association of Liberal Arts Institution. Flame University is part of it, and we have done a lot of co-teaching in the past, and I think it works very well. These are the ways through which we need to start looking at collaborating a lot more, engaging with each other a lot more, because all of us are in the same situation at this point of time, and provided better student learning experience. Third important point is not just only our responsibility towards teaching them the best way possible, but also to start looking at what is really happening. What state is the student in? I think a lot of them who had been in the homes, locked up, because of the lockdown, other things, have had mental health issues. Their parents have lost their jobs. They are they've not been able to pay the tuition. The loans are getting, revoked. Multiple situations are also there. So I think universities also need to be mindful of what is really happening. Just like banks are asking for, tax holidays and NPA holidays and multiple subsidies from the government, I think universities and others and students also need to start working on their own business models to start providing tuition waivers and subsidies and few others, so that element doesn't come in, and also start looking at the mental health issues of the students to look at. That is something which I feel is very, very, very important. On the technology, as you said, where would we go from here now? One thing is very sure, that the days of hugely endowed, physical, expensive campuses are in for a shock. As Scott Galloway is also saying, I think the business model of only tuition paying students coming in, working from the endowments and trying to figure it out. I think we are the only ones in last 1200 years, since 800 AD, we have not changed our business model. Sure. I think everybody else has changed their business model to suit the changing times. And we are in a shock now, because right from pedagogy to content, the way we deliver courses, the program durations, even the degree bureaucracy which happens. It needs to be done in 3, just think of something called Lambda School. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. These guys are challenging even our normal university program itself, because students nowadays, post-pandemic, in next 5 years, will start questioning, is my university degree even worth it to send me to a job in that particular direction, versus I can do a certificate which will lead me through an online program which is cutting edge, which is on the job. And and Lambda School, by the way,
so we've got to wrap up. I'm going to have to hurry you here, because I know you're passionate. I love the passion, but we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's it. So Lambda School, for example, doesn't charge tuition.
Yeah. You
pay them only when you get a job, and they ensure that you get a job. Imagine that business model.
Yeah. So let's go to the let's try and think about the future. There's a couple of things I want you to draw on from your experiences now. One about looking to the future in terms of use of digital. Yes, everyone's made great points. The business model of universities are going to have to change. The way that we operate will have to change. But it does ask some serious questions about A, leadership of an institution, and B, professional development. The amount of times I've heard universities, senior leadership talk to me about technology and never give a second mention about the staff, about how we can build capacity and capability within institutions. It's quite frankly doing universities a disservice. Therefore, to try and wrap up this session, if you can give me your reflections on what needs to change in terms of moving the sector forward, in particular around professional development and in terms of leadership. Amanda, if you could start on this one.
I completely agree. Actually, my former career was in workplace and professional learning. So I worked in corporate learning and development. And I'm always kind of amazed at how little is done in higher education compared to what the private sector does in terms of staff development. So I completely agree with that. There's always been this fallacy in higher education that you obtain a higher degree and you can teach suddenly, like it's sort of some sort of osmosis goes on, you get handed a PhD and you can teach, and that's simply not the case. I think there's a greater realization of that, but that's a huge area. And a colleague of mine has been making some really good points lately about perhaps we need hybrid roles. Perhaps this is sort of where we're headed, where we might, and not necessarily having just teaching people and just research people, but even maybe hybrid roles where it's someone who's sort of a part academic role, but part learning design, more professional sort of role, people who specialize in the learning design part. But yeah, I think that development is going to be huge. And I think part of that development is, how do I choose the right tool for the job? I think people have referenced it a few times. It's not about the shiny thing. It's not about what tools have we got and how do we shoehorn them in. It's about, well, what would the best tool for the job be? And I think of a colleague in Russia who they didn't have access to much, but email turned out to be the best thing they could do. They would make a video, they would load it unlisted to YouTube, and they would email it to students, and that worked for them at that point in time. So yeah, how do we avoid the shiny things and choose the right tool for the job? So it's not really about the technology. I think it's really going to be about the people, and what does the role of an academic look like in the future is going to be very different.
Alex, coming to you, where do you think LSU will look like in terms of leadership and in terms of faculty development over the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think, in total honesty, I think it's going to have to change, right? So I think in terms of, it needs to be led from the top and led down, because I think part of the problem is this technology. It's not like it's just appeared. It's been around for a long period of time, and typically it hasn't won. We haven't won the hearts and minds of people over in terms of the transition to this. I mean, all of the stuff that we're using has been around, and some of it's been around for many, many years. In terms of the leadership, I think, to be totally honest with you, I think it needs to have, in terms of the investments, the technology that we're introducing, we have to understand where the value sits and how that the value can not only just give technology means to the student, but actually doing things, what we've learned from even this period, how that's benefited each and every entity that makes up an institution, and allow people to steer into where the direction of the institution's going.
Yeah.
I think it's largely to do with who owns each various element that makes up of the university, having an active part to play, but understanding where the benefits realization is for them by actually helping to start have a part of it where, in terms of the technology steering and such. I think, and that's kind of just a couple of other points, kind of slightly straying off the question. And I think the bits that really need to be understood is the fact it's a security layer. And I think that for me is still a grey area at this stage, and people aren't aware of the fact that we have suddenly seen a massive influx of people remotely accessing institutions. I know globally, in fact, higher education has unfortunately suffered from cybersecurity threats due to the massive influx of digital. And I think there's definitely been a level of actually understanding now from right up from someone like the Vice Chancellor and other executive members to the concerns that lie. Okay, it's all great, we've managed to get everyone on board, but unfortunately there's been means of people taking advantage of that. And I think even from a student perspective, it's, people need at least be a level of awareness as much in terms of what technology we're introducing, but what the governance layer needs to be over that. I know some speakers on the call today have referenced things like, okay, it's great to become digital, but then you've got considerations. Well, do students always have the connectivity to a dial-in? A lot of them are in shared accommodation, and one of the things we've seen has been the fact that people, you've got 6 people in a house all dialing or working or studying. There's considerations around that. So I think a general awareness, it's not just an IT thing. It's no longer just an IT thing, right? It's not the technology. It actually, in order to technology to succeed in the transition into the hybrid world that we've become, everybody has a part to play. In terms of the success of the rollout of the technology, the compliance, the governance, and making sure that it all does as it should do.
I think that's a great point, and I'll come to you on this one, Romy. People, process, technology seems to be, the kind of critical position for all of this. In terms of Murdoch University, what does it look like for you moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I actually go principle first. Then I said, let's look at the practice, and you get that by talking about the practice, you bring the people into this, and lastly, you put the policy that will enable this. Now, I've got a slightly different view, because I don't think that a senior executive can actually lead this. They have to support it, they have to encourage it, they have to reward and recognise it. But I don't think it works by having the senior people lead, because what happens then, it's felt like people are being told that they have to do this. And I think what you have to look for is actually those champions that are in-house, so that they are actually taking that ownership of things and actually taking things forward. I remember going to a summer school once in the States and kept asking about how did they get buy-in from their staff? This is wonderful, what's going on? How did you get buy-in? And they sat me down and said, you don't need to get buy-in if you engage people and involve people from day one. And that's that kind of, that engagement from the people who are on the ground, and them taking responsibility and accountability. So again, I think that's what we need to do. We need to have that co-design, that ownership with the people, with the staff, to say to them, what does this need to look like? How do you need to be supported? And that's where leadership then has to come in as an enabler to say, okay, so now we've recognised what's needed. You've recognised what's needed. We will enable that by giving the support, the reward, the recognition in the right place. But it is vital. Without the people, nothing will happen, and the people have to help take this along. But we do have to think differently, as Amanda was saying about our roles. I mean, we talk all the time about the fact that graduates of the future will have 15 different roles, 3 different careers. Even if you stay in the same role, your role will change by at least 10% every year and things like that. Have lecturers, academics roles change that much? You look back at the 1200s at Bologna, the people standing on the stage and talking to a group of students. We still do that to a high degree, you know, but we do need to think differently. We can't be sages on stages anymore. We need to be the guide on the side, helping to facilitate the learning, you know, using the digital experience as we go along. But as I say, it has to be a collective effort, I think, to get there, and it can't be a top-down, you have to do this. But it does need supporting. It needs to be enabled, and people have to put the investment into doing that.
Well, I mean, you made a great point, and I'm going to come to you now, Dawika, just to touch on something, because Romy made a good point about, heart, and Alex touched on it, hearts and minds of people, but obviously culture plays an important part in this, and obviously, in the Indian subcontinent, for example, it needs to come from the top down. So, from your perspective, where are you moving towards as an institution over the next few years?
I think it works both ways for us, as Romy also said. Yeah. It needs to. So as a leadership, you have to show and do things first, and show and lead by example. So so from our side as well, the top leadership, the deans and the vice chancellors and others took upon themselves to ensure that we move in the right direction of digital transformation. We were the first ones to move into it. We trained ourselves, taught our classes first, showed how do we go about it. At the same time, as Romy has said, you have to create those champions. So I think not everybody in my institution was digitally savvy to begin with, and we identified those champions. And then those champions actually started helping others without even we telling us. So we just created a task force and empowered them a lot more with no day-to-day monitoring of what the task force is doing, how are they training people, how are faculty responding to it, what are the problems. We would just go and nudge. We just go and nudge and try and see, if people are working hard towards it. And because of the fact that a lot of my faculty members, almost all of them, are very committed towards student learning. They've spent enough time with students, post and pre classes. So they're very, very keen on student learning part of it. So even it was tough for them, they took it upon themselves to learn many technologies and new things and, those kind of things to go about it. At the same time, among the faculty, there were champions who were able to look at it. So I think it works both ways. You have to kind of lead, not push it down, but at the same time also, as and when needed, nudge people. There are people who are reluctant, towards certain things, but also need to make them understand that if they don't learn it, if they don't move forward towards these things. But there's a big lacuna in terms of not just the technology part, in terms of the instructional design part of it. That's something everybody has to now invest a lot more. At the same time, in the Indian university context, we had a CFO, we had all other executives. We never had a chief technology officer. I think it's time for us to also have a chief digital transformation, chief technology officer, build that. We always had people to support as a tech team, everything is fun, but we never had somebody at a C level to drive that kind of a transformation which is needed, right from student body to the staff, to the faculty, to everybody else. And as Romy has rightly said, gone are the days of sage on the stage. Yeah. I think we really have to change whole pedagogy and make it a lot more student centric is what I would say. Thank you.
Absolutely, Dawika. And we've got, it brings us to the end now. We've got last 2 minutes, and I think it'd be useful for our audience to really get some advice from all of you in terms of you. We've got 29,000 universities according to OECD around the world, all grappling with many of the issues that we face in terms of how do we get a university to work effectively in a predominantly online environment now. So drawing on your experiences, I'll go from Romy, Alex, Amanda and Dawika. 30 seconds, what's your advice for institutions tuning in today?
You're not going to fix it all overnight. Think learner first and enjoy the journey.
Alex?
Don't rush in. There's multiple different technologies in there. Take your time. Now, the calm after the storm as such. Understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and then think about the people, process, then the technology.
Fantastic. Amanda?
I think don't forget to bring the academics along with you. and develop them as teachers, develop them as learning designers. They already have the content expertise and then some, so bring them along on the learning journey as well.
Fantastic. Dawika?
My advice is don't panic. Move into transformation slowly. You don't have to rush to it. Third, empower everybody. Empower students to be responsible for their own learning as well, and empower faculty to start moving a lot more into the digital transformative stage.
Well, you know, that it's been a real pleasure to have you all on for this session. I think it's been really insightful. I think that you know, I can feel the passion of all of you in terms of this agenda. I mean, my closing remarks would be absolutely, I echo exactly everything you said. I think we should stop talking about delivering content and start talking about teaching again. I think, you know, I think we should put the students and the faculty at the heart of institutions. And I think senior leadership needs to take a more strategic approach and look to think about how technology can best serve its students, which are the customer. I hate to use that phrase, but the customer, and how we can use technology to better serve them in terms of developing them as young people, in terms of academic excellence, and giving them better life chances. And that would be my concluding comment. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'll hand you back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really, really handy session. I think there's lots of really important points to take away there for everyone. So thank you very much. We'll move on to our final presentation now. So please join the next session. And thank you to all of our panelists and Cameron.